Hello and welcome to History 361 Lecture 8, Free Black Life in the Early Republic. I'm Professor Jamie Bronstein and this is African American History to 1877 at New Mexico State University. Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about the achievement of emancipation in the North and the War of 1812, among other things, in the beginning of colonizationism in America in the early Republic. But I'll start off with emancipation in the North. As you know, in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase expanded the boundaries of the United States. And in this territory, the Northwest Ordinance held sway. It banned slavery in U.S. territories north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi. However, settlers who had already settled in those areas and who already owned slaves were allowed to keep them, and some settlers still imported more slaves, whether they were allowed to or not. During the Revolutionary War, slavery had been outlawed in Massachusetts and Vermont, and other states in the North followed suit. In 1780, slavery was eliminated in Pennsylvania gradually. It was eliminated in Connecticut in 1784, in Rhode Island in 1784, in New York in 1799, and in New Jersey in 1804. However, there were various barriers to emancipation. This included gradual manumission laws that, for example, applied to enslaved people who were born after the laws were passed and didn't release them from bondage until they were in their mid to late 20s or late enough or long enough for them to have worked to pay for their freedom. Another barrier to emancipation was in, for example, Indiana Territory. Slaves were required to labor for 30 years before they were free. In Ohio, laws required that African Americans present legal proof of their free status and post a $500 bond to guarantee their good behavior. These bond requirements for free blacks were common in the western states and eventually reached over $1,000 per bond. The Naturalization Act of 1790 placed further restrictions on free blacks. The law instituted residential and racial requirements for potential citizens. Potential citizens had to live in the United States for 2 years and had to be, quote, free white persons. Without citizenship rights, free blacks could not join the national militia, carry federal mail, or hold elected office in the District of Columbia. And as we're going to see, fast forward just a second to the 1850s, there was also a question in law about whether African Americans were citizens of any states or whether they were in an oddly citizenship-free status before 1857. Isabella Baumfree's story highlights the difficulty that enslaved people faced securing their freedom even in the North. Baumfree, pictured at right, later named herself Sojourner Truth. She lived in the state of New York, and she was held there in bondage, and the state of New York demanded that all slaves be released from service on July 4th, 1827, regardless of birth date. However, Baumfree's master denied her freedom and claimed that she owed him more time because she had a badly diseased hand that impacted her productivity. She ran away with one of her 5 children to an anti-slavery neighbor, Isaac Van Wagenen, who harbored her. And when her master came to reclaim his property, Van Wagenen bought Baumfree's freedom. Eventually, as I said, she left service entirely, became a sort of Methodist preacher and abolitionist, and went by the name of Sojourner Truth. Became quite famous. One thing about gradual emancipation laws, they gave northern slaveholders time to sell their slaves out of state. So Northern blacks were in danger of being sold to the South. Anti-slavery activists and organizations helped to halt their sale. The nation's first anti-slavery organization was founded to combat illegal slave sales. This was the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery and for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. So that is a mouthful, that particular organization. It was founded by white Quakers in 1784. In 1785, white New Yorkers founded the New York Manumission Society, and this organization protested the kidnapping of blacks, both slave and free. All right, so to summarize, you do get emancipation in the North, but it takes a long time, and often people are held back by laws that require them to sort of work off the debt into which they are supposedly born. Free blacks in northern cities formed organizations to support each other. For example, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen were two black Methodist converts who purchased their freedom in the early 1780s, met in Philadelphia, and became lifelong friends. They founded the first Black Mutual Aid Society, the Free African Society, in 1787. Like other free black organizations established during the late 18th and early 19th century, the Free African Society invited members to pay dues, and then that money would be pooled to support those in need in their communities. I should say mutual aid societies were very common throughout early America and even Britain at the same time. Other examples included Rhode Island's African Union Society, founded in 1780, Charleston's Brown Fellowship Society, founded in 1790, Boston's African Society, founded in 1796, New York's African Society for Mutual Relief in 1808, and the Resolute Beneficial Society of Washington, D.C., founded in 1818. So these were all mutual aid societies. Many early members of the Black Mutual Aid Societies initially belonged to white churches, but they often ended up establishing their own churches to escape prejudice. Allen and Jones, who I mentioned a moment ago, and others, attended St. George's Methodist Church until white leaders began to segregate the congregants. After being told that they couldn't kneel with white worshipers, the black members of St. George's left the church in 1792. Allen and Jones never entered St. George's Church again. Instead, they opened the African Methodist Episcopal AME Church in July 1794, which was later renamed the Bethel AME Church, and several other black Methodist churches would join with this one to become an independent AME denomination in 1816. Black Methodist and Baptist churches were often funded by black mutual aid societies. Boston's first Black Baptist church, the African Meeting House, maintained a close relationship with Boston's African Society and also with the city's oldest black fraternal order, the Prince Hall Masonic Lodge. Right here you can see the African Meeting House in Boston. The pews have been reconstructed, but the floorboards are the originals. And if you stand outside the African Meeting House, the Prince Hall Masonic Lodge is sort of catty corner across the street, and the African Meeting House abuts or is next to the African American History Museum in Boston. So if you are ever in Boston, in the neighborhood close to the Massachusetts State House, this is certainly a great place to visit. Many free blacks in the North spent the most productive years of their lives in bondage, and so once they were freed, they couldn't read or write. Northern almshouses were filled with free blacks who were too old to work. And even younger, healthy free blacks had trouble finding work. They were often confined to or relegated to low-paying menial jobs because there were racially discriminatory statutes that put them at the bottom of the labor market. Whites refused to work alongside blacks, so blacks had little choice but to work in service trades that were linked to the work that slaves performed. Black women worked as washerwomen, seamstresses, and cooks, and they sold foodstuffs on the streets, while black men worked as laborers, mariners, barbers, coachmen, porters, and bootblacks. One thing about barbering and being a waiter were two jobs that were often really specific to African Americans in the 19th century, both in the North and the South. And you could be a black barber who waited on white customers, but you could not be a black barber who had both a white and a black clientele. So you could only be barber to one race or the other. In terms of education, free blacks in the North hoped education would improve their life chances, but the few public schools opened before the 1830s did not welcome blacks, so that free blacks and white anti-slavery organizations opened schools to educate blacks. Boston's free blacks opened the African School in 1798. The white membership of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery opened a private school for black children at the beginning of the 19th century, and the white membership of the New York Manumission Society established the New York African Free School in 1787. These schools, founded by white organizations, sometimes were at odds with the free blacks who they served. For example, some of them refused to fund schools taught by black teachers, and the New York Manumission Society's members resolved to, quote, keep a watchful eye over the conduct of such Negroes as have been or may be liberated, and to prevent them from running into immorality or sinking into idleness. Maintaining schools for free blacks was challenging also because many school-age free blacks had to work to support their families. Families couldn't afford tuition, and supplies and books were in short supply. On the slide here, you see a picture of Captain Absalom Boston. He was the owner of a whaling ship, and he lived in Nantucket, which is an island off the coast of Cape Cod. In 1845, he sued so that his daughter could attend schools with white children in Nantucket, and he was successful. And so this was one of the first examples of a parent successfully suing for desegregation of schools. There was another case in actual Boston at the same time, but Absalom Boston lived in Nantucket, as I say. Northern whites perceived free black people as a social menace and an economic threat. Black communities and public gatherings made white people nervous. So whites frequently insulted black people on city streets. Prince Hall, a black Revolutionary War veteran and the guy after whom the Prince Hall Masonic Lodge was named, complained that blacks met, quote, daily insults in the streets of Boston. On celebration days such as Independence Day, drunken white people beat black men and stripped helpless black women. Blacks responded by moving their own Independence Day celebration from July 4th to July 5th. White anti-slavery activists were uncertain about how best to confront racial prejudice in the institution of slavery, and black activists looked to Congress to address the issue. In 1797, they submitted a petition that cited slavery as unconstitutional bondage, and Richard Allen and Absalom Jones wrote a protest pamphlet in 1794 in which they condemned the racist arguments that whites used to justify slavery. But none of these pamphlets or anything were helping. And so when the War of 1812 was declared, black people saw this as an opportunity to win full citizenship. Now, just to review very quickly, the War of 1812 is a war that broke out between the United States and Great Britain in 1812 over several issues, including the impressment of sailors, American sailors, into the British Royal Navy. So British ships would stop American ships, take off American sailors, and make them work in the Royal Navy. That was one reason for the start of the War of 1812. Another was that Americans felt as though the British were encouraging Native Americans along their northern frontier to rebel against Anglo-Americans moving into that area. So there was a pan-Indian rebellion led by Tecumseh, whose sort of culminating battle happened in 1811, the Battle of Tippecanoe. So that was another reason, the sort of idea that the British were getting Native Americans riled up against Anglo-Americans. And then there was also the question of Canada. The Americans were hoping that they might be able to go to war against Britain and take Canada from Great Britain. So all kinds of reasons for America to go to war with Great Britain. When, during this lead up to war, the U.S. ship Chesapeake was fired upon by a British ship and 4 soldiers were impressed into the Royal Navy, and this happened in 1807, 3 of the 4 were black. So even in the lead up to the War of 1812, African Americans were involved. During the actual war, the Maryland legislature had passed legislation barring black soldiers from the militia and the army except as servants or musicians. Even so, in Baltimore during the Battle of Fort McHenry, the occasion for which the national anthem was written, free blacks under the command of Major General Samuel Smith constructed fortifications that saved the city. One of the participants in fortifying Fort McHenry died after having his leg blown off during the British bombardment. Black sailors also participated with the U.S. Navy. They made up between 10 and 25% of the sailors. And here on the left side of the slide, you see George R. Roberts. He enlisted as a gunner aboard the ship Chasseur in 1812. He fought against the British. There is some confusion about what his age was at the time of the fighting. In 1860, he was still living in Baltimore with his wife, had accumulated $400 in real estate and $100 in personal estate, despite the fact that neither he nor his wife were literate, and obviously was known to history because here he is in a picture with a very well-worn coat that obviously has been patched many, many times, probably by his wife. Other African Americans took the opportunity to run to the nearby British in the hopes of being freed. Although the British didn't officially court or try to recruit enslaved people, they understood that slaves were crucial to the military strength of the U.S. because when black people were enslaved, white people were available to fight. So if slaves could make their way to the British, they could stay. One of the British commanders formed 600 runaways into a group called the Colonial Marines, who participated in attacks on Virginia plantations and in Maryland and the District of Columbia in 1814. It was understood that seeing armed former slaves would strike terror into the hearts of Southern whites. Black people also participated in the War of 1812 when it shifted to Louisiana. Andrew Jackson was leading troops there, trying to keep the British away from New Orleans, the outlet of the Mississippi River. Andrew Jackson called for the formation of a battalion of 353 free people of color, arranged into 6 companies under black officers who were men of substance in the community. A second battalion was formed out of over 200 free black emigres from Haiti, mostly people who had fought on the side of the Royalist French during the Haitian Revolution. Jackson did not only, however, recruit free blacks, he also went to plantations, promised the slaves there that if they enlisted, they would get their freedom if the battle was successful, but he didn't follow through with his promise, and he sent those heroes of the Battle of New Orleans back into slavery. Black soldiers made up 10% of Jackson's troops. As you may remember, the Battle of New Orleans took place in January 1815, after the peace treaty that ended the War of 1812 had actually been signed, but Americans didn't realize it had been signed or that the negotiations were over, and the Battle of New Orleans was still looked upon as a great victory for American nationalism. The deep and abiding prejudices that blacks faced in the United States following the Revolution made black and white people question the likelihood that Africans would ever be able to fully participate in American society. Some white people proposed colonization schemes as a solution to the dilemma, suggesting that free blacks be sent to Africa. And some black people wanted to return to Africa. So, for example, in 1787, a group of Massachusetts blacks petitioned the state legislature for support to return to Africa, but their legislature ignored their petition. In 1815, a wealthy black businessman and ship captain named Paul Cuffey took 38 black Bostonians to the West African colony of Sierra Leone. And the map here shows where Sierra Leone is located on the west coast of Africa. The colony had been founded by British reformer and abolitionist Granville Sharp to house London's poor blacks and nearly 1,200 black loyalists from Nova Scotia, many of whom had fled from the United States. Cuffey's father was from West Africa, so after Cuffey visited the colony in 1811, he was inspired to bring African-born men and women there. While black leaders supported Cuffey to a certain extent, whites were the most intrigued, and free blacks got very nervous about how intrigued and excited white people were about the colonization back to Africa of African Americans. Wealthy white people founded the American Society for Colonizing the Free People of Color of the United States, which you should just remember as the American Colonization Society. This was established in 1816. Its membership included prominent white clergymen, lawyers, financiers, and politicians, including Speaker of the House Henry Clay, who argued at the organization's first meeting that free black people were, quote, a useless and pernicious, if not dangerous, portion of population. By 1819, the American Colonization Society had won the support of President James Monroe and had earned a congressional appropriation of $100,000 for its cause. The ACS used the money to establish the colony of Liberia on the west coast of Africa and to recruit potential migrants. Most of the blacks who established Liberia were slaves who had been liberated specifically so that they would emigrate. Free blacks were suspicious of the ACS's program and did not volunteer to participate. So, for example, of 10,000 free black Philadelphians, only 22 joined the voyages to Liberia in 1819 and 1820. The last thing I'll say about that is, in Liberia today, there are many descendants of people who had been slaves in America, and they formed the sort of top echelon of Liberian society and still do, a kind of Liberian elite. But that was only a very small group of people because most African Americans, having been born in the United States, believed it was their country too. Okay, see you in the comments.